Intro. The 1950s was a decade that had to follow the post-World War II world, but also had to start and begin the new Cold War between the United States and the USSR. This is what caused tensions to roll up, but it also caused both players to ramp up their defense and their power by basically being like, but I'm the cooler one. I'm cooler than the other one. So this was one of the decades where the Cold War happened, where both the US and the USSR had nuclear weapons, and you know what that does to a city. We saw it was the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima during World War II in the previous decade. So there's a lot of destruction that happens with them. So you don't want that. But this led to tensions getting high at some points. But also, the Korean War, being a proxy war, also helped fuel that. And also, the U.S. basically building up their own defense system was things like the highway system also happened. But those are different parts of the Cold War that really dominated the decade. But there's a lot of detail to each of them. The Korean War was the big war of the decade, even though today it's really seen as the forgotten war. It's because of how the war didn't end in a win like in World War II, or even in a loss. It really just ended in a stalemate. That stalemate is still there to this day. When you look at North Korea and South Korea, it is just hyper whatever version of the government they were backed by. It's that divide between communism in the North, ruled by whatever leader rules at the time in the South. The South being extremely capitalist, and so, we have a lot of influence on what happens there. So there's that aspect of the war's results that changed the continent, but the war is really what matters the most out of it. The war was full of American soldiers and Korean soldiers. It was a war that was about, you guessed it, defending Korea from the threat of communism and making sure they have our democratic principles. Because when you look at it, it kind of makes sense why that fear was had, especially compared to what it would be like today. In the late 1940s, the Republic of China had fallen to the People's Republic of China, and that country is communist. You can still kind of see that today. You know how communism spreads. That's by allowing it in nearby areas, and since China had fallen to communism, we can't have it invade the nearby Korean peninsula. That's right next to Japan, and we're kind of helping them rebound from World War II. So we can't have that because they're also our ally. To paint the picture further, you also have the USSR, which is also in the neighboring area of Korea. And we all kind of know what's up with the USSR. A little known secret called they're communist. That's bad. And also those are the people we have to worry about. So through a little series of events, we go to war in Korea. Not officially, but you know how it is with these wars. We don't say we're at war or anything like that, but we only have a draft and do everything we usually do when we're at war. Same poop, different toilet, honestly. We have all these people fighting the war alongside Korean soldiers, and so we just kept fighting for 3 years. So it didn't drag on for that long compared to the other wars, but it still did drag on. And so a lot of people, specifically 1.5 million, were drafted for it, so it's not small. But since there were two sides, the US side was the side that was backed in the South, the one that was aligned with our values more, which means the point is to defeat the North and get rid of communism up there. But also, there were soldiers fighting for the North Korean side of the peninsula. Originally, it was just people in Korea was the help of the people who were helping them, like China and Russia or the USSR. But then we pulled an Icarus and flew too close to the sun, We got really close to the Chinese-Korean border and the Russian land. And so those countries got afraid that we would invade them since, they're right there and that's communism. So they sent in some of their troops to stop that from even thinking of happening. So then we just kind of got back to the stalemate position we're in today and before. But then we get the modern borders and they're still there to this very day as of the latest Earth update. But it kind of shows that not every war will be a win. There can be stalemates, but those stalemates are ones that can last a long time considering that it's still there to this day. The war had ended in 1953. It's just that tensions are very high in the region, which is expected to happen when you have one of the U.S. allies on the southern part of the peninsula and then a communist dictator ally of the USSR or China or any of these places on the northern part of it. You can't have dictatorship. That's the whole point. Something's just bound to happen there. But luckily nothing did. Life in the two different Koreas just lived on as normal, or as normal as you can get in North Korea. The decade saw the end of the Korean War in a stalemate, which kind of then ended one of the first proxy wars of the Cold War, because communism obviously has to be defeated, or really the idea of what communism is or was back then, which is different to what it really is today when you think about it, because of how people think about it domestically and foreignly. Now, when it comes to domestic and foreign affairs, there are really only two players that made the big rounds here, and that's the US and the USSR, which makes sense because those are the two biggest countries in the world during the decade in terms of influence. Now, what does this mean being domestic and foreign affairs? Well, it's just like how each country handled the countries that are allied with it, but also their home turf. Like how the US had NATO, like right now, but is also allied with Japan. That's foreign policy. But domestic policy is how the country handles itself, with different projects or different things that help make it better or more efficient compared to before the project was started. It's important to have both because when you're in a Cold War, you really kind of have to have influence in both ways. But it has to be the good type of influence. You don't want people to just be like, well, I'm stuck with you now because you have something that could kill me. That's what the idea of the New World Order is, but it's really the Cold World Order. The World Order that was built by tensions because of nuclear weapons, which were made by the US during World War II, which was a common domestic thing during the 50s for both the US and the USSR. But that's because, yeah, having a military is needed, and you need a way to defend yourself. You just need to have something for defense because they can strike at any moment. So you have to know what to do, and you have to have a defense plan somehow. So you have to build these things up. Defense was one of the main things that influenced the way people thought, but also the laws that were written into law this decade. One of those was the infrastructure project known as, let's just call it the highway, which does have its roots in Cold War mentalities because cars were becoming more popular, and so Eisenhower was like, well, in case anything happens, we need to have a fast way to get people across long distances, or whatever he sounds like. Truly, what highways have evolved into today, if you've ever been there on rush hour. But it was formed out of this Cold War mentality, and even if you look at the maps of the original highway, it's weird to see how many more people are just on the East Coast compared to the West Coast at the time. Obviously, that really isn't how it is today. That was the big thing during the 50s, was that it started the highway, but it didn't finish it because it's a long project to do. Let's be honest. Rome wasn't built in a day type mentality, but it could be built in a long time. So it being started was one of the big feats of the U.S. domestically during the decade. And it was a public road too, so following the New Deal ideas for it. Though we did not have all bangers during the decade, and so for our non-bangers, we have to look at what communism meant back in the 1950s, because as mentioned, it is more loosely defined. It's not this all-be-all thing or ideology. It really, to most people who were using the Red Scare to scare people, was just a way to be like, well, change is communism, and have people know that as a negative thing. Not the change aspect, the word communism, they would be like, oh, that's bad, because it's a corporate buzzword. This can be seen on how they labeled a bunch of things, like even the Civil Rights Act, I'm pretty sure, as communism before it got to McCarthyism. So when you scare people into believing something like that, and by using the word communism for everything and a half, you get to a point that you have people looking out for it. Communism back then, but also in some contexts today, was this label put on people. It was a label to put on you to associate you with either the USSR or China, since they were both communist, but also to label you as a traitor to the United States. Since at the time, the Cold War was really communism versus democracy for the decade. So if you were a communist, you were kind of blacklisted, because you can't be a communist and serve in Congress. That would be bad. You were treated differently because you're a traitor, and that's the idea behind McCarthyism, really. You have these big people, and you can silence their power by labeling them a communist and by making sure that communism is outlawed in the United States. That's what happened through a series of acts during the 1950s. But McCarthyism is not really a baller idea when you look back at it. But that's more of a domestic issue. But the main foreign thing that started was the space race moving on, which started later in the 1950s, but was a thing that dominated the later part of it. It really got into gear when the Soviets put Sputnik into orbit, which is the first satellite to be launched into space. What a feat, someone would say. And they did say. And this is what caused NASA to be formed. So overall, it caused good things, since NASA is kind of our aura farm. It's good to see that the space race did make something actually really cool that our government can do and say we're proud of. But also, in terms of foreign policy, the Marshall Plan, which was continued from the 1940s, was ended during the early 1950s due to the economic recovery that was happening majorly differently in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe, European countries. This is because of the different ways of ruling. You can especially look at places like Berlin and Eastern Germany, which were controlled by different sides. West Berlin and East Berlin were very different due to this control. The control that the USSR had over the countries in the Warsaw Pact, especially during Stalin's rule, was something that was very much authoritarian. I don't think anybody is disputing that. That was authoritarian. That's because it was just straight up too much authority and turned to a dictatorship when you look back at it. It's something that is bad, because you shouldn't have to control your people in order to get them to agree with you. That's a fake type of loyalty you never would want, because then you won't have that loyalty when you need it. You have to have a reason to fight for something. You cannot be expected to be forced to fight and have the same determination to fight on and on if you don't have a personal reason attached to it. That's just how humans are. They need motivation. But in the other news, there is decolonization throughout the world. So, that's good. This isn't too Cold War related, but basically a lot of the territory that mostly Western European countries took from people because they had land, and European countries had things that just invade places. They became more independent. So, Europeans just have all this land, and so now you don't need it. You only just kind of want it. You always kind of did want it. But also, people need to be liberated there. So, you just have to let them do that because that's for the greater good of everyone. So, that's what's happened in, Africa during the decade, and some parts of Asia during the decade. And so, more countries are popping up throughout the world, which is kind of good. People are being liberated. This is how you make every geography nerd excited. You add more countries that they can remember. And overall, people are getting more free throughout the decade. Overall, the 1950s was an important decade, but for different reasons compared to the previous decades. There was a lot that happened because there was a lot of change, and there was a lot more change that I didn't even mention. The world had entered a new phase after World War II, and this was the first full decade of that happening. There is also a lot of change that would happen later on, going into the 1960s and other decades, but that would be for another time. There's a lot to cover for each decade since a lot happens in each one. It's 10 years. You can't really be like, oh, nothing happened. Something is going to happen. But these were the things that were really important and kind of should be noted when talking about the decade. If you have any thoughts or any interesting facts about the decade below, you could comment them down below if you want. But that's about it. Please like and subscribe. Pretty please.